today, which is continuing with the 39 malachas. We're going to go in detail. Again, we leave the questions till after because there are a lot of questions that will come up today. Really, Hilchos Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos, are the most important halachas. They're so strict. We can see the Rambam reiterates so many times, death penalty and this and that. How important are they to God? And there are many, many books on the subject. It's a good thing to learn. There's a lot of information. Nowadays, you can literally Google any question and read in English a long responsa from a notable rabbi. Tonight we have a JLI class. We're going to learn about King Saul. Next Thursday, a week from today, we're having in Yapai College, we have 2 Israeli veteran heroes who are going to come. It's going to be a big event. And then we have the high holidays. Today is Rosh Chodesh. So the high holidays are in a month, which is always exciting. This actually, calendar-wise, the high holidays the first time began today. Moses went up today to get the second tablets. He went up for 40 days, came down on Yom Kippur. So today is actually a very holy day. Tomorrow we'll start blowing the shofar, and so we'll start. Okay. So now we're continuing with the 39 malachas. I mentioned yesterday that whenever the Rambam says chayiv, liable, that means you get death penalty if you're warned. You get kares, which is spiritual death penalty if you're not warned. When he says pater, which means exempt from punishment, it means it's forbidden to do. It's forbidden to do, but if you do it, you're not liable for punishment or sacrifice. If you do by accident, if you're liable. If you do by accident, you have to give a sacrifice. So if you're exempt from all those things, but it's still forbidden. And if he says mutar, which means permitted, then you're permitted to do it on Shabbos. So now we're continuing on baking. If you bake the size of a fig on Shabbos, so this is Rambam chapter Shabbos, Hilchos Shabbos Manim, Hilchos Shabbos chapter 9. If you bake like the size of a fig, you are liable. Whether you bake bread or you cook something, or even if you're cooking spices or you're heating up water, this is all the same thing. That's all considered cooking on Shabbos. You're liable for punishment. What is the shear? What is the measurement of water? In order to wash a small limb, like a pinky or something like that, you just need a little bit of water to heat up. And what is the measurement of cooking things for like spices? Well, whatever you're cooking for, that has a specific amount. If you put a egg next to element in order that it should cook, so in other words, you're not directly putting it in a pot or anything, you're not directly cooking it, you are chayiv, you are liable. Because anything that you cooks from fire, light, that is like you're cooking itself. So there's no real loophole. Similarly, if you wash yourself with hot, similarly, if you wash in a hot, old salted thing or salted fish, so those things, this is kulias haspanon, is a fish, I think it's called sole, which is a very, very light fish, then you are chayiv. Because when you wash it with warm water, then it is considered cooking it. You know, there is a dish called ceviche, and they actually have it in the kosher restaurant in Phoenix, where there's certain types of fish that you can pour like lemon juice and it cooks it, because they're very sensitive flesh. So here, even if you're just pouring warm water on it, it's considered cooking, even though another thing would not be considered cooked with that thing. Okay. Let's say you put an egg into a warm garment or sand, which is receiving from the sun. This is something you can see popular this year, that people cook eggs on their dashboard or on their front of their car in Phoenix and stuff like that. You are pater, you're exempt from punishment. So that means you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to cook outside. I saw a video of someone baking cookies on their car this year, right? You're not allowed to do it, but you won't get punishment. Why? Because the sun is not really cooking. However, the rabbi said, we don't want you to mix up, and therefore you can't use it. Similarly, if let's say you go to Chamei Tveria in Tiberias, there's hot springs, you're exempt. You're not allowed to cook in the waters there, even if some of them are boiling. Yellowstone, you're not allowed to cook in there. If you do, you're exempt from punishment. If you cook something on a fire that was totally cooked, or something which doesn't need to be cooked, then you're exempt. So let's say you have something cooked and you want to put it in a pot. Even though it's already cooked, you're exempt, but you're not allowed to do it. One guy lights the fire. and then one guy brings the wood, and then one guy puts on the pot, and then one guy pours water into the pot, and one guy puts the meat, and one guy puts the spices, and one guy comes and mixes it, they are all chayiv. They're all liable for punishment. So it's not like there's one main act there. They're all doing so this goes in, you're not allowed to mix, you're not allowed to add spices, add water, add a pot, add wood, anything like that. Anyone who does any of the needs for cooking, this is cooking. However, yeah.
One quick question.
We do the questions after on Shabbos, but one quick question.
One quick question, because I read in, I think it was in this parsha, for some reason it made it seem like you could have deer and milk, or gazelle and milk.
So there is an implication for that, but the rabbis say you can't.
But it says in the Torah that you can.
In the Torah it says you can't cook a baby in its mother's milk. That's what it says.
Right,
So
but also
yeah.
there was a thing that said you could, that it doesn't apply, a lot of the
all right,
laws
so
don't
in the
apply to
Talmud it
deer
says
and gazelle.
that chicken and milk is rabbinic decree, but it's just as strict. And it may be as well as deer. It might be rabbinic according to some opinions.
Yeah, because I wanted to have a deer cheeseburger, I guess I'm not going to get.
Well, you can get an Impossible Burger, and now the big halachic topic that everyone's talking about is when you're making genetically modified beef, right? So you're making it from cells of non-kosher meat, and that's the big topic.
It has to be shechted.
And that will make a big difference. That might make a big difference. Okay, anyways.
It also might not.
All right, it might not. Okay, now, so that's a case that everybody is liable. However, if one person put the pot on, and then afterwards someone put the water, and then afterwards someone put the meat, and afterwards someone put the spices, and afterwards someone lit it up, and someone put the wood, and afterwards someone mixed it, only the last two people, once there's fire, right, there's no problem filling a pot with water. So only the last two people have done the action of cooking. You understand the difference? So if the fire comes first, then everyone's liable, because everyone helped cook. But if the fire comes after, only from the fire point on is that considered cooking. Because I just put meat in the pot. I didn't cook anything, right? I could have put meat in the pot and stay there the whole day. So therefore, the first people until the point that someone added fire are not liable for cooking.
Even if he knew,
Sounds like
Even if he knew.
can't.
Even if he knew,
because
because
he was preparing.
Because you cannot, there's a rule, Ein shliach ledvar avera. There's a rule that you cannot send someone to do a sin, right? So even if you prepare it, it might be wrong to do if you confuse the guy and say, hey, we're buds and everything like that. But you're not liable. You won't have to bring a sacrifice. Only the people who go on from the fire on, because until the point of fire, there's no cooking.
But without the other things, there's nothing to cook.
That's true.
So aren't you causing your...
Well, so only
Man
the guy
to
doing the
stumble.
fire, you may be causing him to stumble. That might be another sin, but you're not breaking Shabbos.
different thing?
That's what we're talking about, not breaking Shabbos.
Okay.
You put meat on top of coals. If it's cooked like the amount of a fig, even in 2 or 3 places, I guess they could even be combined, you're liable. If it's not cooked that much, but the whole thing is cooked halfway, then you're liable. If you cook it half the amount of the cooking from one side, you're exempt until you flip it over and you have half on both sides. Let's say you are, back in the olden days, the way they made bread is you have like a round oven and you stick pita on the side, right? That's the way they do it in the Talmud. In fact, in New York or Israel, the really good pita places, the really good falafel places, that's how they make it right there, right? So you stuck it on and now it's heating up and you remember it. Now technically on Shabbos, you're not allowed to take it down. But because you want to save yourself, you can save yourself from the baking so you won't be liable. Okay. If you melt any type of metal or you heat up metal until it becomes a coal, that is cooking. You're not cooking food, right? But you heat up something, that is cooking. Similarly, if you melt wax or fats or tar or anything, there's any substance that you're heating up and it's changing it, that is cooking. Similarly, if you're cooking things to become like clay, pottery, to make them hot, that is cooking. General rule, whether you weaken it, melt it, or whether it comes hard, that is considered cooking in the Torah. Next, malacha, gozes. Gozes means to shear a sheep, literally. Now, in the Mishkan, there were many things that were made out of sheepskin and made out of wool, right? So you're not allowed to shear a sheep on Shabbat. So if you cut wool or hair, whether from an animal, it doesn't matter what type of animal, whether from alive or dead, even if you're cutting from the skin, that is chayiv. That is liable. What is the shear? What is the amount that you're liable on? So again, I just want to mention, chatzi shear usr. If you cut less than the amount which is liable, it's still forbidden. You just don't bring a sacrifice. So if you heat up a fire and you're really good at making sure that the meat isn't heated up to the right extent, you like it really rare, you are still not allowed to do it. You're still not allowed to benefit from it. We're talking about the point you become liable for punishment or sacrifice. Okay, what is the measure? What is the shear of cutting in order to spin one string which is long as a sit kuffel? What is a sit kuffel? A sit kuffel is, if you measure from here to here when it's totally extended, so double that, and that's the 2/3 of a zeros. Okay, which is the amount of this. So basically the difference between your thumb and index finger. Okay, twice. All right, if you now let's say let's say you take off feathers from a bird, that is also gozes. That's the same thing as shearing, right? Even though it's like a different type of thing. Let's say you spin it on while it's still on the animal, so then you are not liable because that's not the normal way of doing it. And same thing with niputs. Niputs means to they brush it, but they kind of bang it until it becomes small strings. All right, let's say you cut your nails or your hair, any hair goes through your beard or whatever it is. That is a tolda of gozes. That is the same thing as shearing a sheep. And you are liable, and that's so as long as you do it with a vessel. If you do it with a vessel, like you do with scissors, then you're liable. However, if you do it with your hand, you are exempt.
And
Let's say you pull off your nail, you pick your nails, or you bite your nails. So it's forbidden to bite your nails on Shabbos, or to do it with your fingers, but you're not liable until you do it with a vessel. You got that?
What if it's more than halfway?
Then, okay. If you, let's say you pull off a wart or something like that, then that is exempt, whether you do it for yourself or someone else. In the temple, basically Kohanim had to have no blemishes, so they could take it off with their hand, but not with the vessel. And if it was dry, they could take it off with the vessel and do their work at the temple. If you cut your hair, how much do you need to cut to be? So you cut it with scissors. How much do you need to cut to be liable? 2 hairs. And if you're taking white hairs out of your brown hairs, even 1 hair. Now, I just want to mention that in Jewish law, a male is not allowed to pull out his white hairs because that's considered acting like a woman in Jewish law. So that's besides the point. There are some exceptions, but
Allowed?
what?
Allowed.
So
Pull
too
out,
bad for
cut.
the zakanim.
Yes. No, so the
old
reason
folks.
is because 2 hairs.
have that problem.
When you cut hair, you have minimal 2 hairs.
yeah.
But when you're pulling out a white hair, the 1 white hair is doing the job, right? Okay. Let's say you have a nail which is partially cut, a broken nail, right? And it's partially cut. If it's majority cut, and similarly skin, which is like, hanging off, if you take it off from the top and it hurts you, then you're allowed to take it off with your hand, but not with the vessel. So you can't cut off a little piece of skin or whatever it is, so you can pull it off. And if you take it with a vessel, you're exempt from punishment, but you're not allowed to do that. And if it doesn't hurt you, even with your hand, you shouldn't do it. And if a majority didn't come off, even if it's hurting you, then you can't take it off with your hand, and you take it off with a vessel, you are liable. Okay. Now we're moving on to wool. So you have the wool, and then we mentioned menapets, and we mentioned it in the side way. We'll get back to it. Okay. Now what you do is you have to whiten the wool before you dye a different color. Whether it's wool or linen or crimson wool, all these different things that you make them white, you are liable. And what's the shear? In order to spin, what is the measurement? In order to spin 1 thread, which is double this amount, which is around 4 tfachim, which is around 12 inches.
This word that's translated as sit.
Sit. So we said earlier that a sit is double this amount. Okay. If you launder, you're not allowed to launder things on Shabbos. So that includes like washing them off or whatever it is, clothing. This is a told of malabin. This is whitening things. You're not allowed to launder. And if you squeeze let's say you have a wet thing, and even if you're walking and you have you didn't know it was going to rain, your jacket got wet, and you squeeze it to get the water out, that is also not allowed. You're liable, because that's part of laundry. So you're not allowed to squeeze a wet towel out. Interestingly enough, if you have, sometimes you're washing for bread or shul and there's a towel and it's very, very wet, you're not allowed to use that towel because you're going to squeeze water out of it.
So let me follow to what might be absurd. So if I'm soaked in rain on Shabbos and I sit down on a chair and the water comes out from where I sit,
That's okay.
that's okay.
That's okay. Because you're not so malachas, you have to have intention, to do something good, to do something beneficial, and you have to be concentrating. So now, to be liable. So now, let's say you're going to sit on a chair, and you're like, wow, let me get some water out of my chair, or water on my clothes, let me sit down, then that will be a problem. But if you're just sitting
Well,
down...
if I'm not aware of it, then
Yes.
I'm okay, but now I'm aware.
Well, if you're aware, but you're not... Well, so we'll talk about the rules about that later,
Okay.
about unawareness, non-awareness. There's certain times when you're not aware that you're not allowed to do something, even if it's not your fault. And we'll talk about this later. Don't worry, we have about 20 more chapters of Shabbos. And there's certain times when it's okay. Okay. Anapitz semer, so that's where it's kind of like banging it, but you take two brushes and they go like this.
Carding.
So that is liable. And what's the shear? To get one strand, one thread, which is 4 hand breadths. Same thing, like what they would do is they would sew with, like we have on our tefillin, they sew with sinews of animals and stuff like that. So if you do the same process, that is liable. If you dye a strand, which is 4 tefachim, 12 inches, or something that you're enough that you're able to sew or with it or weave with it, then or spin with it, you are liable. And you're not chayiv, you're not liable until the dye is permanent. However, if the dye is not permanent, for example, you take something and you rub it on a metal or something like that, then that's exempt. So again, permanent dye is liable, non-permanent dye is not liable, but it is putter, which means you're not allowed to do it. Because you're only changing for a little bit and it's not really a dye. Generally speaking, a malacha on Shabbos, something that you do which is not permanent, is exempt. And that's what we'll see. So exempt means you're forbidden to do a non-permanent malacha, but you are not liable if it's a non-permanent malacha. And we'll give other examples of that. Okay. If you make the ein hatzeva, means the eye of the dye, which, I believe you're making the concentrate of the dye. This is a tolda. So you're not dyeing anything, you're just mixing stuff together, and you are liable. For example, you take kalkantoim l'seich me'avta, one chemical, and you put it in gallnut, it makes it all dark. Or istis and mecharkim and saffron, I don't know exactly what these things are, it makes them all green. What's the shear? If you make enough dye to dye a string, a thread, which is 4 hand breadths, which is about 12 inches, what? Questions after. We do questions after? Questions after. Wait a second, I want to do... Mendel.
Like holding a hammer and then
Question
it
after.
went down and
Okay.
maybe it's not a-
If you do the length of 4 tefachim of any of these things, 4 tefachim is 4 hand breadths, you're liable. But whether you are sewing, whether you're spinning wool, flax, linen, or hair, or feathers, silk, or any of these things, or sinews, if you make, if you now halfway through 6 to 15, I'm not sure this will give me a second. What is it, Paul? You mentioned.
Okay.
So if you make felt, so if it's things from a substance which you can make 4 tefachim, 4 hand breadths, you're liable. Okay. Now there is a big section of Shabbos, which, believe it or not, there are many toldes and malachis. It's all about how to weave on a pedal and everything like that. So we're going to go through that now quickly. If you make shnei batei nirin, so these things are much easier if you have a picture, but you have both sides of this weaving machine, right? So you make those, you're liable. If you make a nafa or kvar or all these different things, which sift or basket or anything like that.
Sieve, strainer, basket, hairnet, weaving a rope, beds.
So now you're making all these tools essentially, then you're liable. And when you make them as one, you make two of these heddles, then you get each one you're obligated on. And similarly, if you make the two heddles with something which you make button, houses, I'm not sure exactly how it works, you are liable. Okay, so now the rambam is going to go through. So now you basically, right, so you have these two heddles, and then you have the strings going around like this one way, right? And then you're going to lift them up and put the, what's the middle piece called again? The
Shuttle.
shuttle. You're going to put the shuttle through and then close them back and forth, right? So the rambam says the people who weave, they put in the strings in the length in one way and in the width, and then two people hold it here and here, and one puts the shuttle through. Two people hold it. One of them puts these strings, and he does it from this side until it makes a one-way strings going across, and then they put the shuttle through. Okay. So this is called weaving. So weaving, again, weaving in the Torah could be any type of weaving, crocheting, anything like that. But we start off, the avis are the biblical way of weaving. Biblical way of weaving. And there still are people who have the biblical way of weaving nowadays. It's still an art with a lot of fancy tools. Okay. Okay, number 18. How does 18 start?
One who sets a weave is liable, and it is one of the primary categories of forbidden labor. Beating on the threads so that they are separated and aligned
Okay.
constitutes a subcategory of setting a weave.
So setting a weave is forbidden, and anything which you prepare from that. So if you're preparing those strands, that is also liable. What's the shear? Until you prepare the width of 2 fingers. Similarly, if you do 2 strings on the width of two fingers, whether you're doing it in the beginning or you're adding to another one, it's the same amount. And if you do 1 string and then you finish that generally is 2 strings, width of 2 fingers. But if you're finishing off the garment, you just need one more time through, then you're liable. If you are doing the end of it, 2 strings, the width of the 3 heddles, then what is this like? This is like sewing a small
Thin belt with a width of 3.
thin belt with a width of 3 heddles. If you are, okay, so now what if you're sorting them out and you're straightening them out? That is also considered weaving. And similarly, if you're combing the strings, this is also weaving. So this is, nowadays we don't really, there are some different things, but if you're dealing with strings on Shabbos, we'll see soon, there are potentially malachas that you could do. If you cut 2 strings, you are liable. If you cut
Well, this is as separate.
separate, voila, severance, correct. Okay, number 20. If you cut 2 strings, you sever 2 strings, you're chayiv, and if you sever, and this is that you separate the weaving. Whether you take out one direction or the other direction, this is liable, and this is that you're not doing it to destroy it. If you're doing it to fix it, just like people do when they're re-sewing stuff and stuff like that. However, if you're, generally speaking, another rule for malachis, let's say you're destroying, yesterday we mentioned, if you're destroying something, you're not liable, unless you're destroying it for a reason. So now, we said yesterday a reason might be because you're angry. And when you destroy something because you're angry, that helps you calm your anger. So that's considered a valid reason. But if you're just destroying for no reason, then you are, like you're fiddling around or whatever it is, then you are not liable. I apologize that I'm not great with the weaving thing. I could do some review on that. It's quite complicated to figure out those machines.
For the terminology.
But when you're a kid, a lot of times they'll take you, there are different museums and stuff like that, which teach about Shabbos, especially in Israel. They'll take you to show you exactly how these things work, because they are important. Okay, let's continue on just a second.
Last question.
Yes, you can ask questions now.
Different because of the amount involved.
Mendel, can you get the Gemaras? Mendel, can you get the Gemaras? You have your question next.
So if you bake something equal to the volume of a dried date, you're liable. But if it was less than that, you would not be liable.
Correct. You would not be liable.
Okay, so that's where the
But it's forbidden, but you're not liable.
understood.
Sorry, dry date. I kept saying dry fig.
So the volume of the thing, in both cases, it's not permitted, but whether or not you're punished is determined by the volume involved. So
Correct,
that's my question. Is that creating a situation where there are degrees of a transgression? In other words, the volume involved doesn't determine whether it's permitted or not, but it does determine whether you're punished or not.
Correct.
So is that not creating a precedent or a situation where a transgression has degrees, has different levels of the transgression?
It absolutely is. It is.
So does that create a problem where a person could think that
How far can I go with this?
it's not, well, if I do the, if I restrict my transgression to the point at which I will not be punished, then I'm actually not doing anything wrong because I'm not being punished for it. Doesn't it create an incentive to cheat?
It can, but in general, if someone has that perspective, then they probably have to brush up on their fundamentals of Judaism. In other words, you're right, it can do that, and it does do that. It is that. However, pater means exempt. Exempt is also forbidden. If you do something which is exempt on Shabbos, you have sinned. You did do a sin. Not every sin is about sins aren't about punishment. Sins are about going against God. So the technicality of how bad the sin is, like as Jewish people, we shouldn't care how bad a sin is. We should look at all sins equally in that sense, because basically, for God, all sins are kind of equal. It doesn't really matter. You're going against God. So if someone does say, "Hey, I'm exempt from this. I'll do it, even though it's forbidden, and I'm sinning, but I won't have to pay any money, to buy a sacrifice," or I won't, then he's off, because he's not supposed to sin at all. So when it says pater, if you do it, when it says exempt, which exempt means it's forbidden, if you do it, you have sinned.
But for the weak-minded,
What
shall we say,
What? Yeah.
sorry,
Yes, correct. Weak-minded will make that mistake. It's a mistake.
Does the idea of being punished for something, is that like because as differentiated from Padam, is that how would I say this? Because you did harm with this sin and with this other sin, no harm was done. What makes it to where you have to do tshuva or make an offering or something? What's the difference? Why?
So,
you know what I'm getting at?
So the Torah has different layers of sin. So let's say this one here, it's an interesting thing, because some people will say, what's worse, to do a sin by accident with the sacrifice, or do something which is exempt? So some will say exempt is worse, because I don't have such a clear way of doing teshuvah. If I do something which I'm exempt from punishment, and now, so if I do something which I'm liable, so now I'll bring a sacrifice, and I did the teshuvah. That's what God said the way to fix it. When I do something I'm exempt from, which is forbidden,
There's nothing you can do.
what can I do? I have to change my whole life. I can't just get out with bringing a cow to the temple, right? So really our attitude is when something's forbidden, and the Pirkei Avos says this, you should never weigh what's worse or what's better. You should never weigh what's worse. The only people who get to do that is the rabbis. But in there it says, because you never know, for your soul, God, there may be worse retribution, as well as it may be more offensive to God, because we don't really know the spiritual side of things.
and I don't see, I'm
That's
sorry.
interesting.
I don't see the point, then, of that distinction of being punished or not.
Right.
Well,
If-
so yeah.
If it's black and white as to whether or not it's permitted. So what is the reason, why create a distinction based on degree when in fact there is no degree, there's no gray area
It's an absolute.
with regard to
right?
the transgression itself? So what's the point of the other?
So this God says that if you do this, you can fix it by death. If you do this, it doesn't need to be fixed. That's God's system that God created. So the Rambam is just quoting God's system of what's forbidden, what's exempt, what's permitted. Now, there are other loopholes, like sometimes when there's a semi-emergency on Shabbos, or things like that, if you can do things which are exempt, it's better than if you can do things. But really, back in the olden days, it's like, what do I have to do if I broke Shabbos? Well, God said, if you do this, this is what you have to do. If you do that, that's what you have to do. In general, you have to avoid that. So in other words, these are God created. So it's not a system to help us keep Shabbos. This is the system of Shabbos which God created.
These degrees.
These degrees are in the Torah. Yeah.
There must be some more to it that we don't.
These are the
understand,
tradition.
or we
These were
haven't
passed down
understood.
from Moses.
Can I ask something about work?
What's like? Mendel had a question. Mendel, what was your question?
Oh yeah, sorry.
What if you have a nail that's more than half off?
If you have a nail that's more than half off, if it's bothering you, you can pull it off.
But you can't cut it.
You can't cut it, and if it's not bothering you, you can't pull it off. But if it's bothering you, then you can pull it off.
I'm trying to wrap myself around the whole Shabbos thing, and so, but so I can't write with a pen or a pencil on the Shabbos, right? Writing?
We'll talk about writing in I think tomorrow, but
Oh.
If you're forced
but
to write, it's better with a pencil,
you can
but
write
I love
actually.
that.
So it's interesting. You can't write with a pen or pencil. There is, if you need to write, or if you're going to write, so it's not as bad as a pen because a pencil is not permanent.
Okay, so let's say I'm preparing for.
So it's forbidden to write with a pencil on Shabbos, but you're not liable. With a pen, you'll be liable.
That's interesting. Well, what about the thought? So let's say I'm.
So there was a rabbi
planning
who went
on-
around New York when
Yeah.
everyone was breaking Shabbos in the beginning of the establishment of Judaism in America, in the early 1900s, and he literally went to every store and said, "Here, write with a pencil instead of a pen on Shabbos."
to reduce the.
So you'll
damage.
reduce the damage done. Yeah.
Well, okay. So in with respect to reducing the damage, so let's say, in my mind, I'm starting to think about next week and what I got to do, but I'm not writing anything down with a pen or a pencil, but I'm going over things in my head. Now, am I sinning? Am I violating?
So that is
Shabbos.
not a sin, but we'll get to it. In code of Jewish law, it says you should train yourself not to do that. It says really righteous people should not think about work or think about what they need to do the next week, unless it's a mitzvah. So on Shabbos, you're not allowed to talk about money, unless you're making pledges or doing something with a mitzvah, talking something with a mitzvah.
That has man
So
associated with it.
yeah, you're not allowed to count money, you're not allowed to touch money.
Okay.
But you can think about mitzvah money.
Because all
Are
these.
you,
all
are you
these-
allowed to think about money, but it's just not it's not good?
You're not, yeah. So thinking, there's no malacha of thinking. In other words, you're not, in general in the Torah, thoughts are never punished for you're never liable for thoughts. But the rabbis say you shouldn't think about, weekday things on Shabbos.
I guess, it's kind of, I'm feeling like I'm a Jadeite, let's say. I don't know if you know. This was a sect who believed that, they didn't want to cause any harm, and
Yeah,
so
okay.
they wouldn't walk. They would have to be careful where they step because they didn't want to step
Yeah.
on a bug. So, because you have all these. So I'm trying to look for some guidance from God, in terms of anticipating what's wrong. What is you
So-
don't work, right?
So there's a couple secrets to keeping Shabbos, I think, which are in the Talmud, which are very fundamental. One of them is, it says God spoke to Moses and he said, I'm going to give my greatest gift to the Jewish people, which is Shabbos. Shabbos is a gift from God. So if you're not viewing it as a gift, it'll be very hard to keep Shabbos. If you're viewing it as a yoke that you need to change your life to, then it will be very difficult. If you're viewing it as a gift, then you will look for opportunity to keep Shabbos. That's number one. So, that's number one.
When in doubt, don't do it.
Now, generally, Shabbos is the type of day that, again, it's something that you have to be train yourself little by little and becoming more and more conscious about Shabbos. Like on Shabbos, you don't have to not walk on bugs. But if you're purposely killing bugs with your feet, then that's not allowed. So, when you learn the laws of Shabbos and you start to keep it little by little, and you do all sorts of different things, then eventually, and you know that you're going to get to a point where you will have the ultimate peace.
And these things in maybe you can share some more of those secret things in the Talmud, because that is helpful.
Yeah, so the Shabbos and the Rambam we'll talk about at the end. The Rambam only talks about laws, but he sometimes puts in something. But generally, Shabbos is not something where you can like collect and keep all things in kind of OCD fashion. It's something where you have to get the essence of Shabbos.
Yeah.
And you have to know, what do I need to do on Shabbos? And then what I need to do, I can cut out what I'm not allowed to do from that. So I'll give you an example. Like, if you are occupying yourself with spiritual things on Shabbos and holy things on Shabbos and mitzvah things on Shabbos, so the mitzvah of Shabbos, you have to have pleasure, good food. Of course, you have to prepare it the day before, etc., etc. You have to pray. The prayers are longer on Shabbos. You hear the Torah on Shabbos, all these different things. If you're occupying the time with that, then you won't have time to do the other things. However, if you are if you're going to be walking through a mall on Shabbos, then you will have to you'll be involving yourself in the negative. You'll have to cut a lot of things out and be extra careful. But if you're in the right place for Shabbos, then it's a lot easier.
Right place physically and mentally.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
Okay, so let's learn a little bit of Gemara.
Thank you. Helpful.
We're on the bottom of page 37. So we were talking about mincha. Bottom page 37 in this book here. You want to follow? What time is it now? It's 10:05. So there's enough to share with my husband. So I said, well, I recommend you buy a book. And they said, I'll share with my husband. So I said, okay, I'm just not going to order one for you. It's not a big deal. Each student book costs like $30. So I'm very strict about myself ordering them, because like I have zero use for it. And then it's like all I need is 5 books, which are worth $150, which I can't do anything with them. And they're from an old course, and that's the way every course is a new course. There's nothing you can do with it. So I ordered it on Sunday when I got a bunch of reservations in, and then it's coming tomorrow. But they're going to send me a little booklet with just tonight's class. Okay.
Well, we registered for 2 people. So.
Correct. Well, I believe everyone should register for the full. It's just that's the normal way of doing the class. But I understand, like, some people register for themselves and then they come last minute, and some people, are just. Anyways, so let's go. These classes are difficult because you have to charge for them because they're so expensive. The budget for JLI if I do 3 courses this year, just adding up everything, costs about $6,000 just to do the class for my expense. So that will, for it to pay for itself, there will have to be 60 people throughout the year. This course, 21 people signed up. So I have, this course did well, but, different courses do differently. Okay. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar. Rabbi Yochanan says, so this is what he said. We just said that Elijah the prophet says, Rabbi Chelbo, we're saying statements Rabbi Chelbo. He said, a person has to be very careful with mincha. Why? Because Elijah the prophet, in his story, was answered during mincha. Mincha has specific significance. Now Rabbi Yochanan says, even Ma'ariv, the second last paragraph, he says even Ma'ariv, and Rav Nachman says even Shachar. So you have to be careful with all 3 prayers of the day. And they all bring verses to support how important it is to pray, obviously, and how important it is to pray 3 times a day. Rabbi Chalboi says, name Rav Huna. We're on the bottom of page 37. If someone goes to a wedding and they don't make an effort to make the groom happy, which that is done usually by dancing with him and joining the dance part, so he just eats the meal, he violates the 5 voices, as it says. Kol sasin v'kol simcha, it says in the verse, the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the groom and the voice of the bride, the voice of those who say, give thanks to the Lord of hosts. For the Lord is good, for his mercy lasts forever, even of those who bring thanks offering to the house of the Lord. For I will restore the captivity of the land as it was in the beginning, says the Lord. These 5 voices in context of a bride and groom correspond to the 5 voices mentioned in the context of Revelation at Sinai. As in Song of Songs, the day of the revelation of Sinai is alluded to the phrase his wedding day. So every wedding is connected to Sinai, the 5 voices at Sinai, and therefore if you go against,
We sing this, right? Call,
if
so,
yes, that's in part of the blessings of the weddings. If you go against, if you don't bring joy to him, if you don't try and bring joy to him, and you're there at the wedding, then it's considered going against those 5 voices. Okay. And if, what is the reward if you cause the groom to rejoice? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Zoicher l'Torah. You acquire the Torah, Shenitim b'chamisha kailos, which the Torah was given in 5 voices. Shneim v'ahi b'yam ha'shlishi v'yasa b'oker v'hi kailos avrakim v'anan kavod al har v'kol shefer v'hi kailos shefer v'alakim yanen v'kol. So it says the time voice 5 times at Sinai. So when you do that, you will merit the voices of Torah. So it says, along with the 3 previous voices, the sound of the shofar and the voice which God answered Moses amount in total of 5 voices of revelation of Sinai. So the Gemara says, Eini, is it so? It says, the whole nation saw the voices in the torches. Clearly, there are more than 5 voices mentioned with regard to Sinai. Oisan koilais the koidim. So we have 5 times it says the word voice with regard to the giving of the Torah. And then it says the nation saw the voices. So and that's additional to 5. So it seems, why? So we're making just a proposition that the verse that says kol sasim v'kol simcha, that voice, that verse is in Jeremiah. That's referring to the 5 voices of the giving the Torah. But in fact, there were more than 5. Maybe we're not talking about the same thing. So the Gemara answer is no. If you look carefully, the voices that the nation saw, those were before the giving of the Torah. Rav Abo is going to talk more about marriage. Ki'ilu ikri hikriv toida. The reward for causing a groom to rejoice is the same as he had offered a thanks offering in the temple. So we've been talking about the sin offering. So in the Tanya, actually, when it comes to tshuva, it says that there's the sin offering, that if you sin, you made a mistake, you have to give a sin offering. But that, just because you do a sin offering doesn't mean you're good with God, right? In other words, I paid the debt. Then there's what's called a shlamim, that's to make peace with God. Then there's a toda. Toda means to say thank you in the first place. In other words, something happens in your life, you give a sacrifice to God, not because you did something wrong and you're filling the debt, not because you're fixing and you want to be good with God, but because something good in your life happened, God, I want to give a toda. So when you cause a groom to rejoice, it's as if you gave a toda offering, a thanks offering to God. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Kilu Bana Achas Mecharvis Yerushalayim. It is considered as if you built one of Jerusalem's ruins. So there's a mitzvah to build the ruins of Jerusalem, rebuild the ruins of Jerusalem. So when you have a groom, he's getting married, and you go and spread joy with him, it's as if it's a mitzvah, as if you are building the ruins of Jerusalem. And now we're saying more statements from Rabbi Chalbo. Now let's just read the corner about his personality. Top corner. Rabbi Chalbo was known as Rav Chalbo, was a 3rd generation Amora in Babylonia who ascended to Israel. He was a primary student and learned most of his Torah from Rav Huna. Apparently Rav Chalbo ascended to Eretz Yisrael, Israel, towards the end of Rav Huna's life, and he was already in Israel when Rav Huna's body was taken there for burial. In Israel, Rav Chalbo had a colleague-disciple relationship with Rabbi Yochanan and became one of the leaders of halachic authorities of his generation. In the field of Agada, he was a disciple of Rav Shmuel bar Nachmani and cites Agadic traditions in his name. Rabbi Chalbo resided in Tiberias, where he had ties with Rabbi Yeshua Nesiah II. The Talmud relates that he was not survived by children. So Rabbi Chalbo, here's some more statements by him. Here we're having more like Haggadah. It says, Kol Adam Sheyesh Bo Yireh Shamayim. Anyone who has fear of heaven, Dvarav Nishmayim, his words will be heeded. Shenamar Seif Davar Akol Nishma Aselakim Yira. As it says in the verse, the end of the matter, all having been heard. Fear God. End of the matter, all having been heard refers to the words of the one who keeps his commandments, for this is all of man. So this is from Ecclesiastes. Now the idea of this is everything is heard from someone who fears God. If you fear God, God listens. My kizek halamim, because this is all of man. What is it meant for? This is all of man. Amar Rabbi Lazar, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Kol Ha'olam Kula Le'Never El B'Shvil Zeh. The ultimate purpose of the world is for people to fear God. Rav Abba Bar Kana Amar Shakol Keneged Zeh Shakol Kol Keneged Kulo. The end of the verse teaches us that this is equivalent to the entire world, all of man. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma, Amar Kol Ha'olam Kula Le'Never El L'Tzavis Zeh. Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, and some say Rabbi Shimon ben Zoma said, not only is he equivalent to the entire world, this person, but the entire world was created to serve as companions for him. So he would have society in which to live and in which to interact. All right, let's do a couple more sayings from Eichelbo. So these are different verses. So that is a concept the Rambam actually explains in great detail in all his philosophical works. He says the whole world is created for people who fear God. Every detail of the world is created to set a stage for the fear of God, and therefore someone who truly lives his life where God is the only priority, and the only goal, everything is created for him. And he actually goes through in great detail. You have animals and humans are working and everything like that, all a setup for those who want to serve God. Not all at once.
Is there a discussion somewhere? Are you laughing?
Did you say not all at once?
Yes. I just saw you wanted to say something.
Well, yeah, just it popped in my head when you said fear of God, and I thought, you know what? How would you fear God if you were not aware? So I'm using the word interchangeably. Fear means that you're aware of God, that you actually, because there's a lot of people going around, there is no God. How can you fear God? Because you're not aware. You have to be aware.
Correct. So fear, first of all, typically does not mean fear of punishment.
Right.
Because that's considered selfish in Judaism. If you fear punishment, it's like you fear suffering. It's like, who really cares if you suffer, right? In other words, you care, but just because you don't want to suffer. So fear usually means awareness and respect. And in other words, making God is what's important, giving importance to God, making your life God-centric. Yes, if you're not aware, then you won't know. And once you're aware, you can build on your awareness.
Yeah.
So if this statement that the world was created as a companion for him, meaning someone who fears God, why are there Gentiles in the world?
The truth is they can also fear God. But someone who does not fear God, or things that don't fear God, are a tool to help the things that fear God. So everything that happens in the world is to set you up, like Adam, to express your God-centric, God-centricism.
Mm-hmm. You need contrast, or you can't make out the background.
So yeah, that's an important thing. I mean, the Rambam goes in great detail, but something to think about. The whole world is set up for us to.
God wants a relationship.
Yes.
I know He exists. That's we're here to. I don't know.